How's it going, everybody? Sean from LUMIX Live here, and we've got a kind of short-ish video for everyone today talking about Flash. So we've been talking a lot over the last couple of weeks about how I wanted to do a stream that kind of just introduced people into how to use Flash and strobes with LUMIX cameras. And I've got a little bit of a setup here with a couple of Godox strobes. So these aren't really what you'd put on top of your camera. As well as the remote triggers that you would work with, in this case, the X3 from Godox as well. But I'm not just going to stick to using strobes like this. We are also going to talk about pocket flashes or strobes that you would put on your camera. In this case, I have a Westcott FJ80IIM that we're going to talk about, as well as a Godox V860 So we're going to go through, take a look at how to get these things set up for, various different kind of controls. So things like TTL control. So for those that just want to be able to throw it on there and let the system kind of auto expose things for you. But also then go into manual control through the LUMIX cameras, what you have access to, what you don't have access to, what the differences are between using a wireless trigger versus the flash directly on the camera. And then also go into how to activate high-speed sync for situations where maybe you're going to be outdoors and you want to be able to still use your flash, but a much wider open aperture, which will force your shutter speed to go above what the standard sync is for the camera that you're working with. So with that, let's kind of jump right into it, and we're going to be using my S5 Mark II as the demonstration camera for this. All right, so the first setup that I want to kind of talk about here is using these kinds of on-camera pocket strobes or just on-camera flashes with your LUMIX camera. Now, it's important to know which brand you're going to be going with when you want to find a compatible flash with the LUMIX ecosystem. Now, in many cases, what you're going to see is, at least with the Godox brand, you're going to see on the product itself, it'll say V860 or whatever the model number of the flash is. And then you're going to have an indicator with an O on the flash itself. Now, what that's indicating to you is that this is on the Olympus TTL protocol, which means that when you want to use TTL, the system has the understanding for the language that's used to communicate TTL between the flash and the camera. Now, in a certain case like this with the FJ Westcott or the Westcott strobe itself, this one doesn't carry the same kind of iconography for determining what its compatibility is. So for this, you're going to want to actually go to either Westcott's website or read on the box to see what flash protocols are supported by the device. In this one's case, it's a little bit more open to many different camera brands that are using a standardized hot shoe, so that this will basically identify what camera you're using and what TTL protocol it needs, and then it will tell you on the back of the flash itself. So that's like step number one. Make sure you're buying the right flash or the right strobe. And it's pretty much the same story when you want to go for an external trigger. Now in this case, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is the Godox X3. With the Godox products, you'll notice that there's kind of a common thread that these triggers or some of the actual on-camera strobes are going to be designed for the camera system that you're going to want to use. So in some cases that can lock you in to make sure that, one, if you're buying a LUMIX camera, that you have to buy the right strobes. You have to be a little more careful with that, and same with the triggers themselves. Outside of that part, which is really just identifying whether or not you're going to be able to do TTL, and in some cases whether or not high-speed sync may work, when you go to strobes like this, these are the AD100 Pros, and I have an AD300 Pro as well. Those are very agnostic when it comes to what camera brand you're using, because these are only going to function based off what this trigger tells it to do. So you want to keep that in mind when you're looking at what kinds of strobes you want to go with. Now, one of the other things to kind of keep in mind when you are kind of going down this path is understand what you need strobes for. Are you an event or wedding photographer where you need portability and mobility first? that can indicate, okay, maybe I need to stick more to the pocket style strobes, what I call pocket style strobes, which would be your on camera. The vast majority of these now, at least in the modern era, are all going to have some wireless functionality. So you may not need a remote trigger if your flash itself has the ability to do wireless transmission. Now, you may have some limited functionality when you use some of these methods for wireless transmission that you don't have with an actual dedicated trigger, but those will be things that you have to kind of figure out what your needs are in your style of photography. So with all of that said, let's actually take a look at this Westcott flash when we attach it to my S5 Mark II and what the screen looks like and what you want to have kind of basically set up to make sure that everything's going to be good to go for your session with a strobe. Okay, so first things first, what you're going to see here is that with this strobe itself, you have a full touchscreen interface on the Westcott style. So this is going to vary depending on what camera brand or what flash brand, you want to end up working with. So don't worry too much about what the user interface is, because this is going to be totally dependent on the flash itself. The core information that we're going to kind of talk about is what you really want to pay attention to. So with this, we're going to take this flash and we're going to attach it to my S5 Mark II. So quite simple, just mount it onto the shoe and make sure that you are tightening down the lock piece on the strobe itself. This keeps it from being, potentially falling off. The other thing that you're going to take a look at is notice up in the top here, now it says LUMIX. The second I plugged the two together, it picked up that, hey, I'm using the LUMIX TTL protocol, so I have all the information I need now. Once you have that set up, you literally can just go in and tell this flash, hey, do TTL, which is through the lens metering basically, and I'm good to go. I don't really want to worry too much about the flash itself or what settings I want to put the flash onto. It's all going to be handled for you, and in some cases can make capturing with flash a little bit easier, but also it's much more restrictive in what you can do for the kind of shaping that you can do with studio strobes or with on-camera strobes. So now when working with these strobes, you're going to notice that there's usually going to be some sort of mode option available. In this case, it's a touch screen, so it has mode here. So when I tap on mode and I activate it, you're going to notice that TTL will change up here, and then you're going to get a plus and minus icon. Now, TTL flash is going to be really, really basic on many cameras as far as what control you have. So if you want to make any kind of changes, this is where you're going to notice that they're really, really, again, limited in what you actually can change. So in this case, it's basically thirds of a stop. And while it can be great to work with, you have to remember that you're going to lose some of the control that you really want on shaping your light. When it's going to be all set and ready to go, you'll see that you're going to get a couple of pop flashes first, which are basically telling the flash, hey, I'm triggering, it's measuring the light output, and then it's going to adjust the power of this flash on its own. But ultimately, no matter what direction you're going to point this flash, whether it's behind you, whether it's pointing directly at your subject, whether you're going to actually do what's really recommended with a lot of flash, which is you want to do bounce flash. So you want to bounce it off a subject or off a ceiling or a wall or something. That's going to give you a kind of a more even, smooth light. And when that happens, you notice again that it fires, gives you a couple pops. If I push it straight forward and I get my shot again, it's a little less pops because now it's more powerful. But each of these are going to give you kind of your overall power output. Again, the problem or the challenge with this is that it's very simplified. I don't have control to say like, hey, I want to be quickly adjusting things, or I want to keep my flash at a certain power, because what TTL is designed to do when you're using it is to bring the entire exposure basically as close to middle gray as you can. It's based off metering. So if you have a really, really bright white background, and you're using TTL, it's gonna bring that white dress maybe, or the white background maybe closer to gray. It's not really gonna get out there and like kind of keep its proper tone that you're kind of seeing in person. So you wanna make sure that you're using it in situations, or you understand how to use it in situations, so you're not taking a ton of photos and then realizing like, oh, I have to bring all of these into post and I have to boost the exposure because everything's too dark. This is where switching your flash into manual flash can be a much better use of your time and the tool that you're working with. Again, TTL is great. I don't want to kind of rag too much on TTL because it can be very useful, especially for very casual type capture, which is why point and shoots have a flash on them. Usually they're going to be TTL. You're going to get that very classic kind of just blast a flash and not really a whole lot of contrast in the image that you're making. But with full manual flash, I can go in and say, hey, I know I need to have the flash up at a much higher power level. I can set my shutter speed to say, leave my shutter speed at 200th, 250th of a second, whatever it is, keep my ISO where I need it, and then just up and down based on third of a stop increments. So if you're someone who shoots manual for standard photography, this is going to be pretty relevant to you, or at least relatively easier to understand, because you're working in third of a stop increments. If you want the image to be a stop brighter, you boost the flash by a stop. You don't have to change the exposure values on your camera itself. Your flash is what's controlling that power. Where this changes pretty dramatically is if you're going to be doing things like long exposure with flash. If long exposure is something that you're kind of going for to capture, right? Maybe you're using the live view composite function and you want to use a flash to kind of lock a subject into that frame. That's a situation where manual flash is going to be basically required to work with. TTL is not going to do what you want it to do. And at that point, you're able to have a really long exposure base. So if you're using live view composite, you could be like 3 hours into a photo, put a subject in front of the frame, pop a flash, and it's going to lock it right into the frame. That's where you come in and you start with different powers of the flash. So you understand, like, all right, if this is a 10-minute exposure and I want something to show up into the frame, I need to provide the amount of light that would equate to about a third at minimum of my exposure time. So if it's a 30-second exposure, I need to provide enough light that would equate to about a 10th or 10 seconds worth of exposure. And that exponentially changes as you're using flash. So it means I have to be a little more powerful in a certain scenario like that. Now, if you're doing headshots, that's usually not that big of a deal, because with headshots, it's more about, I know what my lighting ratios are. I know that I want to have maybe a one-stop difference between this side of my face and this side of my face. So maybe if I'm working with off-camera flashes, this strobe may be set at, say, 1/32nd of a power, and this one may be set at 1/16th. That'll give me a one-stop difference between the exposures there. So then I can start crafting with light as it goes. But with on-camera flash, that's where you start to run into it being a little difficult to do things like that. You have a one point of light that's coming off the camera. And when you'll notice is that if I have the flash pointed straight forward, this is where you're going to get that really, really harsh light straight onto your subject. If I bounce it up off the ceiling, I'm going to get a wash of kind of even light falling all over your subject. If I end up wanting to bounce off a wall, so if I'm photographing a single subject right on, and I've got a nice white wall on the side, then I can fire the flash off that side, and that'll create contrast, because now you've got one side of it kind of shadowed away from the direction of the light. But then also you've got the ability to fire behind you if that's where your bounce wall is, things like this. TTL flash, when you want to work with bouncing light, can be very tricky. When it comes to LUMIX cameras, they're going to function just like every other camera does in this particular case. Bouncing flash, being able to control the light that you want on your subject, those things don't change. That's just basics of exposure. So nothing special about a LUMIX camera in that case. Nothing special about any camera in that case. Where it does come into play is when you want to start working with like high-speed sync, when you want to start working with off-camera flashes and a trigger where you want to not have the light source coming directly from the camera itself. You want that light source coming from elsewhere so that you don't have either a really harsh, kind of push right on the front of the face, which can cut a lot of, the kind of shading or shadowing that you're trying to do. So that's where you want to kind of be a little cognizant of how you're setting your lights up and deciding whether or not I go to a on-camera strobe or I go to a trigger. All right, so now let's talk about using triggers. So we talked about, TTL and when you're working with a flash on camera, but and some of the challenges there, but when you want to start crafting with light, when you want to start being able to do like what we just talked about, those lighting ratios, being able to say I want a stop difference between the left and right side of the face, or I want to work with a single strobe and I want to make sure that I'm keeping the depth of the image that I'm trying to go for. I don't want the system kind of auto-compensating to bring everything to a relatively neutral place. Off-camera strobes and triggers are basically what you are going to need for this particular style of capture. Now, when I was in school, one of the first things they always, kind of do when you're introducing someone into strobe or flash work is you work with a single strobe. It's very easy to overcomplicate flash photography by buying those pre-built kits that have multiple flashes in there, and then you want to use every single one of them because, you spent the money on this kind of stuff. But ultimately, I find it's a lot easier to work with one strobe and maybe a reflector if you need it, or a wall that is white, like what I have over here, not the painting, or the canvas, the wall behind it, so that you can actually start understanding how light shapes and how shadows can add contrast to your particular scene. So for that, using strobes like these AD100s, which aren't like crazy powerful flashes, but they're going to be way more than you're probably ever going to need for many types of photography, and a simple trigger, these are what are going to get you the understandings to then determine like, hey, I need to add another flash, or hey, I need to be able to light my background with a flash as well. So we're going to take a look at the trigger itself. Now, what's kind of cool about this is one of the newer triggers that they make. This is a fully touch interface on it. So in this case, it is designed to control the TTL protocols for the Olympus or the LUMIX system, since we share the same TTL. So you do have TTL function with this, but you're going to get control over various different groups. You can add many different groups of flashes together to work with, and then you can also remove the actual like groups that are on here. So you can pick how you want everything to work. You can control the lighting ratios, set them up how you want it, and then say, hey, I want, a one stop or a two stop difference if I'm working with two. But with these kinds of controls, you're going to see, as I mentioned, once you start going into TTL control, that you're working in third of a stop increments, just like you do on the camera for basic exposure. So this doesn't change in the basics of, how you would normally work. The big difference here is that when you're going to work with any kind of off-camera strobe, you don't want to be changing the settings on your camera. What I mean there is, if I'm working at the, kind of standard mechanical sync speed, so in our camera, say it's 250th or 200th of a second, right? I want to leave the camera at 200th of a second. I want to set my aperture so that I can control the depth of field, how much I want, which it may come to a lot of people's surprise that a lot of times you're going to want your flash you're going to want your camera exposure set where maybe it's 200th of a second because you want to freeze motion or really take advantage of how much motion you can freeze with a flash. And then you're going to want your depth of field, if it's in a portrait session, you're probably going to want that around like 2.8, f5.6 for a more traditional kind of portrait. Because while yes, ultra shallow depth of field is a really cool thing to work with when you get into a full frame camera, or even in the micro four thirds when you're shooting on say like, 25 to 50 f1.7, that's great. But if your subject's turned, if you're kind of like working there, you still want to have both eyes, in enough depth of field that they're sharp. You want to have priority over which eye you want to have as your sharp eye. But if they're turned, I don't want it to be like where it's focused here, it's sharp, and then it's just completely out of focus, on the left eye. So you want to kind of understand how to use that. So you set your camera up to know how much depth of field you want. You set your ISO to whatever you're most comfortable with, which can be, 100 if you're trying to work at the lowest, kind of base ISO that your camera has, or whatever the lowest number is before you go to extended. Those are your kind of core basics of kind of working with the camera. What the flash then is doing is supplementing light, is saying, hey, if this is a totally dark scenario and I want to not have necessarily all the background lit here, I know that 200th of a second at 100 ISO in f5.6, that background is going to be completely dark. You're not really going to see much. You'll see the lights that are up here, but you're not going to see much of the background. I really just focused on the lighting effect that I'm going to get on my subject in front of me. There, you start looking at what the ratios of the light are that you want to work with. This is where, in some cases with manual, at least the way I was taught, there's going to be a little bit of, kind of trial and error in some cases. And this is a good way for you to understand. I definitely recommend people, when you want to start working with flash for this, is one, why I recommend using a single strobe. It's a lot easier, less variables to work with. You can kind of start to understand how they affect the image. But when you have that kind of shot and you're setting a strobe up like this and say, hey, I want this to be at, say, 1/16th power. I want to have this fire. You take a shot and you may see like, oh, that whole side is completely blown out. So then you got to figure out, how far you want the flash away. Are you using modifiers, that kind of thing. That is all details for maybe another stream, about how to capture with flash photography and how that side of it works. But when you're working with the off-camera flashes, you don't always want to be like kind of walking around, going up to the flash, changing something, go back to the camera, take a shot. Walk up to the flash, change something, go back, take another shot. That's where your triggers come in. These triggers are all going to give you those various controls to say, hey, I want to be able to adjust that one particular flash. I want to swap it between TTL or full manual. In this case, we're talking manual. I want to be able to make my minor adjustments onto that particular image, and I don't have to change my positioning. Now, with the LUMIX system, when you're working with a trigger, this is a situation where you don't have controls on the camera itself. So you want to have a trigger that has controls that are easy to access for you. Personally, I really like the X3 trigger in this case. I know it's kind of sounding like an ad for Godox. It's not. I just am using what I like to use. This is what we use for things like we're at Adobe Max. I was using these strobes. When we're going to be at CES in a couple of weeks, these are the strobes I'll be using for our photo session area. It's just easy to be able to jump in, make my changes with this because it's a touch interface. They have older ones, they have other triggers. Don't really get too hung up on which trigger you want to use because the core basics are always going to be the same. But once it's attached onto the camera, that's where it's going to lock the camera system into what its maximum trigger is, or its maximum sync speed. So you want to look at your camera and see what is the trigger or the sync speed for your device. Most cameras are going to be anywhere between 1/60th and 250th of a second. You'll see some out there can go much, much higher depending on the sensor design that they're using. But in general, 200th of a second, you're going to be perfectly fine to freeze motion. Where it gets into a lot more complicated area is when you want to start doing things like high-speed sync. High-speed sync requires some setup on your flashes and on your triggers. So we're going to break from this particular setup because I'm not actually going to be doing any kind of like photos here of this. But we're going to actually take some close-ups of the various different strobes, the trigger, and show you what iconography you want to look for to enable high-speed sync. And then at the end, I'll show you on the screen, kind of what that looks like, what it enables, and how you make it work. All right, so we're looking at the back of the Godox AD100 Pro here, and the basic information that you have on this particular setup will kind of identify what mode you're in, if you're in TTL, if you're in multi, if you're in fully manual. In this case, we're in fully manual. And what you want to understand about what you're seeing on this screen here is the channel that your remote trigger is going to be functioning on, the group, in this case, this is group B, the mode that the flash is in this case, it's M, You have your power level on this one because it's a battery powered strobe. And then in some cases, you'll also have your focal length. So the focal length is really just how directed the beam is going to be on this. There are modifiers, but that's a separate stream that we would talk about. And in some cases, you'll also have a modeling light that will give you kind of information here that the modeling light is on. This is really kind of a way that you can work with strobes and pre-visualize how the shadows are going to fall on a particular image that you're capturing. Because with strobe, like a lot of people have kind of probably noticed, with strobe, you don't really know what your exposure is because the way the system is working, you're not seeing the strobes. When the strobe fires, you're going to get a pretty different looking image than what you'd get normally. And with the LUMIX cameras, this is one area where this is a much more traditional experience, or what I would call a more traditional experience with flash photography, because the screen, when you're going to be firing a strobe, if you're at that really dark scenario, like I mentioned, that say 200th of a second at f5.6 at ISO 100 in a room like this, it's going to look dark. The flash is what's going to be added in later, and that's a really hard thing to simulate. Some cameras simulate it modern. It's still not really simulating what a flash is going to show you because your lighting ratios don't get shown that way. So using something like the modeling light on your strobe is how you can help kind of identify how are my shadows going to fall. Is this strobe in the right position for, say, like a Rembrandt style lighting scenario where it's really, kind of right across the face and you've got a nice little triangle shadow from the nose on the cheek. So as you're looking at this, you kind of understand the basics of it. We have our exposure on this particular strobe. This is at a 64th of a second. I can roll the dial on the back and I can change this within, in this case, tenths of a stop, which is how this particular strobe is set up. So I can roll this and kind of get myself where I want my power to be. You also typically have your test, so I can test fire it, make sure that everything's working. But if I want to get into high-speed sync, and I want to be able to capture with a shutter speed faster than what the camera normally wants to set its mechanical shutter sync speed to, this is where there's a little kind of icon right on here that's a little flash icon with an H next to it. Now that's not necessarily universally the high-speed sync icon, but in many cases this is what you're going to look for. So with this, you'll notice that because it's written on the actual kind of body of the flash, it's not on a button, it means that it's going to be a press and hold. So for these flashes, you're going to press and hold, and then you're going to see H with that little icon show up on the top there. That now means that this strobe is ready to go for high-speed sync photography. Now, if I want to go in and change and work, say, with my trigger in this case, so I've got my Godox trigger. In this particular case, I'm going to swipe down from the top, go to Settings, and then you'll see an option for Sync. Now, when I click on Sync, you'll see Front Curtain or High Speed. Now, it's hard to see here, but when I change the trigger to high speed, or let's do it this way. If I change this to Front Curtain, I pull this away, you notice that now the strobe here is back at front curtain. But if I go back onto the trigger and I tap high speed, now the strobe itself is set into high speed. This is what enables you in this particular combination to be able to capture at much higher shutter speeds than what your camera's normal sync speed is. A couple things to keep in mind. Strobes, when you're using high-speed sync, are not really ever going to be fired at full power. You're usually going to want to lower the power on this strobe to be able to get a properly evenly exposed frame. And high-speed sync isn't always going to result exactly how you want it. But why you would use high-speed sync is a scenario where it's really, really bright out. You want to shoot at a really shallow or a shallower depth of field, and you want to keep your exposure settings pretty close. So say I want to be shooting at, f1.8, and I want to be at ISO 100, but my shutter speed, in order for that image, because I want to bring the background in also, is just really, really, kind of over bright because 200th is too slow. It's letting too much light in. This is where I want to raise my shutter speed and be able to shoot at, say, maybe 1,000th of a second, maybe 2,000th of a second. High-speed sync enables you to be able to go in and, in a very basic level, it is interrupting the flash duration shorter and shorter and shorter because you're shooting at faster and faster shutter speeds. If you don't have this set up right, this is where you get black bars in the frame because you're actually catching some of the shutter blades as they're opening and closing. But high-speed sync, because it can adjust that, that flash duration of how long that flash is on, it adjusts accordingly based on your shutter speed. So you want to make sure, again, if you're going to use high-speed sync, make sure that your strobe, one, has the compatibility, and this is something where you're going to want to make sure that you have the compatibility with the camera brand that you're working with. So in this case, my trigger is an Olympus TTL protocol trigger, which is also a LUMIX trigger. You want to make sure that that is within the same realm so that when I am coming in here and I am setting this up to do the sync, that it's set for high speed, it links properly, it knows what the protocol needs, and it knows how to adjust it based off what the camera is able to do, because again, that communication protocol is an understanding between the camera and the flash, and you want to make sure that they know what each other are saying and how to adjust on the fly accordingly. So once you have those two things set up, with the strobe or the trigger making sure that you actually have high-speed sync or access to it, with the off-camera strobe itself, like the Godox here, once you have those things set with the H and the lightning bolt or the flash icon, you know that now you're set up as high-speed sync and you're ready to capture images like that. All right, so now when you're actually looking at the back of your camera, a couple of things that you're going to notice when you are working with high-speed sync is that as it sits, you won't have an indication on the actual screen itself as to, you know, are you in high-speed sync? What you will be able to tell, whether or not you have it on, is what your maximum shutter speed can be set to. So on this particular camera, if I try to adjust my shutter speed any higher, you notice that it's at 250th of a second. That's indicating that I'm set at the, in this case, front curtain shutter. So this is just using the maximum mechanical shutter that is there without any access to high speed. When I want to enable high speed, just like we talked about before on the trigger, if I change this trigger to now say that it's activating high speed, when I come in and I go to change that shutter speed, you'll see now I can raise that shutter speed up much, much higher. I have access to go all the way up to 8,000th of a second. That's your easiest indicator to say, hey, I've got high speed on, I'm ready to go. The other thing you'll notice too with the LUMIX cameras, when you have a trigger attached to the camera, is you'll get a little flash icon in the top. That indicates that I'm ready to go, that it detects the flash or the trigger that I have attached to the camera, and it knows to keep within those bounds. So again, I've got it set in high speed right now, so I'm up at 8,000th of a second. If I go back onto the trigger, I come in and I change this sync to front curtain, notice that it dropped right back down to 250th of a second for this particular camera. Again, this is an S5 Mark II. So as long as you've got those kind of core basics understood, you know that you're going to be good to go for flash work. A couple troubleshooting things: if you are using a strobe on your camera and you have it on the camera itself, but you don't notice the little icon here, that can mean a couple of things. That can mean either your flash is not actually properly attached, maybe it's the wrong flash, since, as I said, the flash hot shoe is a relatively kind of normalized standard across the industry. So you shouldn't really have too much of a problem there. But there are some manufacturers that are making these proprietary hot shoes on their cameras, which could cause some problems with this. So that's why you want to make sure that you're using the proper strobe for your camera. But once you make sure that it's seated properly, you then will get that icon. And this will be the same whether or not you're using a trigger or you're using a on-camera strobe itself. Aside from that, you do have some controls within the camera's menu itself for changing the way the flash system works. So flash mode on these cameras, when you press into this, Depending on the flash that you use, if you use one of our flashes, so one of the LUMIX flashes, you'll have these different controls here for, say, red eye flash, slow sync with red eye, or just forcing the flash off. This can be a useful one when you don't want to take the trigger off, but you want to jump between capturing with a flash and without. But by default, you're going to see that this is just set to strobe. Then you also have flash adjust. Again, this is going to be really more when you're working with TTL or just kind of globally adjusting how the flash imparts onto the image itself. Using full manual, typically these aren't really going to make any changes to your image, so usually you'd end up just leaving those at 1. Flash synchro. You have first and second. First, these are the curtain activations, so first curtain, second curtain. The easiest way to describe this is if you're using flash with, say, a moving subject, say a car driving down the street with its taillights. First curtain is going to trigger the flash at the beginning of the exposure. So if it's say it's a 10-second exposure, that flash will fire at the immediate second that you press the shutter, and then the duration of your long exposure will continue afterwards. This would result in that particular scene of a car driving away from you, the tail lights being illuminated, the image of the car, and then the light trails moving through the car itself. Not always an ideal scenario. It's probably not going to come out the way you want it. Now, second curtain does the opposite. Second curtain in a long exposure will let the exposure run. So if it's a 10-second exposure, you will start the exposure, your flash won't fire, and then when you get to the end, the last split second for the duration the flash needs to fire, then it will trigger. That will result in an image of the light trails moving away, and then the car in this demonstration or in this example, the car being illuminated with the flash and frozen in place. So you have that control within the LUMIX cameras as well. Then you also have some of these other controls which are grayed out, as you can see here. So things like wireless, wireless channel, wireless FP, communication light, wireless setup. These are only accessible when you use a LUMIX flash or if you are using a tool called a Pocket Wizard. Pocket Wizard are remote triggers that you can use for strobes, for off-camera flash, for studio flashes, things like that. They're one of the only companies that have a direct ability to be controlled through our camera menu system. So maybe not as common these days for being able to pick up, off-camera flash the way modern use cases are, but you do have controls for actually changing the groupings and the power levels of the off-camera flashes when using something like the Pocket Wizard off-camera strobe or off-camera triggers. But outside of that, like I said, these will be only accessible when you are using our flashes. Now, wireless FP. This is only something that you're going to use when you're working with our strobes, with our flashes from LUMIX. Wireless FP is going to be the wireless basic high-speed sync that allows you to do high-speed sync when you're using our ecosystem. So like I mentioned before, high-speed sync in many cases has a pretty standardized icon for it. Within our cameras, as a carryover from many years ago, it's still called wireless FP when you are using the LUMIX flashes themselves. And in this case, you'll see it can only be accessed when wireless is on, and because I don't have one of our flashes set on here, I can't enable it. So, like I said, this was a kind of just general conversation about strobes and flash with LUMIX cameras. I think the big thing to take away from this is that working with strobes on a LUMIX camera really isn't that different than working with strobes on many of the other cameras that you may have experience with. There are certain intricacies that will be different, so things like our constant preview takes a much older school approach or a more traditional approach to this in its current state, which means that what you're looking at with a longer exposure, because you have a flash on there, it's going to be a darker image. This is where using things like the built-in modeling lights is going to be a really big benefit, and many of your flashes have modeling lights. You may have never used them, but they have them. This is so you can understand where that strobe is going to be placed. You understand what direction your shadows are falling. And in some cases, depending on the modeling light, it'll give you a rough estimation of what the exposure is going to look like. You still have to play around with some of your general exposures if you're not using TTL, so that you understand like how strong or how weak you want that flash firing. The other big takeaway here from this stream was talking about the overall models that you want to work with. So making sure that if you are buying something that has TTL functionality, that you're buying the correct strobe. That in the case of these Godox that we looked at, that it has the O icon on here that indicates that this is for the Olympus or the LUMIX TTL ecosystem. That means that you're going to have full access to TTL. We also talked about when you're using something like this Westcott strobe as well, that in some cases they may not have the icons on here as far as what model they're compatible with. That's where you want to make sure that you're reading either the manual, looking at the box, or going to the manufacturer's website and seeing what systems they are compatible with. In some cases, a single strobe may be designed to be compatible with multiple camera systems, and it will identify when you have it attached to the camera itself. The other thing, make sure that when you are attaching any of these accessories, whether it's a on-camera strobe like this or a trigger, that you are locking them down into place and making sure they don't come off. This will keep you from running into situations where the flash is either not recognized or you get intermittent triggering with it. That can be a #1 sign of where to look for a potential problem here. The last thing we talked about is high-speed sync. High-speed sync is something that I know a lot of photographers are starting to get more and more into. It's not a new concept, it's been around for quite some time, but high-speed sync really is that useful tool when you want to be able to capture at shallow depth of fields, out in broad daylight, in a fully lit environment, where you want to still have the environment, but you want to be able to fire that flash because the overall exposure is going to be way too high or way too bright for a, say, 200th of a second, where your camera's maximum sync speed may be. High-speed sync is also that useful tool when maybe you don't want to start stacking neutral density filters so that you can bring that exposure down. You want to just be able to work fast. So you have that ability within the cameras. Our cameras do have access for high-speed sync when it's on-camera flashes with the Westcott, the Godox, as well as the actual LUMIX strobes themselves. And with the Godox system, from what I've worked with, we have the ability to do high-speed sync with strobes like this, the AD series. This is the AD100 Pros that we were using for this demo. It does also work with the AD300 and the AD600 as well. So you have access to do high-speed sync with the cameras. You just have to make sure that you're setting your tools up right. So with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. I know this was a little bit of a different stream because it was, yes, we're talking about LUMIX, but we're really talking mainly about strobes. And hopefully you understand by now that strobe photography or flash photography, while yes, there are some cases that are very unique to each brand, are pretty generic across all camera brands that you want to work with. So thanks again for tuning in. I appreciate everyone's support this year in LUMIX Live, and I can't wait to come back to an actual live stream with everybody in 2025. If you're going to be at CES, swing by the booth. Matt Fraser and I will be at CES at the show. We'll be in the normal position where Panasonic is, right in the central hall, so I encourage you to come by and take a look. If you like the video, if you like the info, drop a like. If you want to see more like this, leave a comment in the video and let us know what you want to know specifically about working with strobes, or honestly anything with these cameras, and we'll work on creating more content. And I think I'll be doing a little bit more recorded sessions like this so we can keep on target and I can get you more in-depth information than necessarily what we do on the entire live streams. So other than that, I hope everyone has a great end of the year. If you've got family, friends that you're spending time with, enjoy that time. Remember, use your cameras for fun things. Yes, a lot of you work and a lot of us work in photography and videography, but every once in a while taking the cameras out and capturing memories is what's really one of the more important things these days. So thanks again, have a great holiday, and I'll see you in 2025.